Colonialism and imperialism are typically seen as two of the most controversial subjects when discussing world history. These two terms are often used interchangeably, and in general they refer to the period of European domination over a variety of different continents and peoples and cultures, anywhere from about 1500 all the way up to World War II. As the age of exploration was underway in the 1500s and the 1600s, European powers began to understand that they could assert control over areas in North and South America, Africa, and Asia in order to set up colonies, extract resources, exert political or economic control. There were a variety of reasons, and it often depended on which area geographically, what the conditions were in the European country, what the conditions were in the indigenous population, so on and so forth. Here is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy discussing the difference between colonialism and imperialism. Quote, "Colonialism is a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. One of the difficulties in defining colonialism is that it is often hard to distinguish it from imperialism. Frequently, the two concepts are treated as synonyms. Like colonialism, imperialism also involves political and economic control over a dependent territory. The etymology of the two terms, however, provides some clues about how they differ. The term colony comes from the Latin word colonus, meaning farmer. This root reminds us that the practice of colonialism usually involved the transfer of population to a new territory, where the arrivals lived as permanent settlers while maintaining political allegiance to their country of origin. Imperialism, on the other hand, comes from the Latin term imperium, meaning to command. Thus, the term imperialism draws attention to the way that one country exercises power over another, whether through settlement, sovereignty, or indirect mechanisms of control." End quote. I think it's safe to say that colonialism refers more to the early period of this European domination that was more focused on acquiring territory, establishing colonies, and extracting resources, and in general this was usually seen as happening in North America and South America. And then imperialism is more of the later period where you're getting into the 1800s and the early 1900s. It's less about territorial and direct control as opposed to a more indirect political control and indirect economic control that's going to benefit the European country. And typically this imperialism is seen as happening more in Africa and Asia. But whatever term you want to use, there was this period in history known as the Scramble for Africa. And what it was European powers in the 1800s, especially the late 1800s and the early 1900s, establishing control in Africa. So whether it be colonies or indirect political control or economic control, European powers were doing whatever it took to exploit the continent economically. Obviously, this period of European countries scrambling for colonies and resources was a big cause of World War I, as we've talked about, but it's also significant for the legacy that it left. And that legacy is controversial both among historians and in the public sphere. There's a variety of different narratives for colonialism or imperialism that you're going to see historically. I think that two different opinions typically rise to the top as being the most popular, although neither one is particularly satisfying to me. So one narrative that you're going to see is this ends justify the means narrative, where all of this colonialism and imperialism stuff was bad and it resulted in slavery and the deaths of millions of people and economic exploitation and all these bad things. But ultimately, all of that bad stuff led to the Columbian Exchange and a global economy and a more connected world that ultimately benefits the most number of people. And ultimately, that process allows us all to be sitting around on our iPhones texting each other. So in my opinion, at least people that subscribe to this opinion will say, obviously, those horrible things that happened, like slavery, were bad, but ultimately, kind of the ends justify the means, and we have a better world now because of it. Obviously, if you've listened to any of my podcasts here before, you know that I'm never a fan of ends justify the means arguments, as most of my work here has been spent debunking that type of thinking. But there's also an argument about colonialism and imperialism that I've seen as becoming increasingly popular that in many ways is the total opposite of that perspective, but it's also not 100% satisfying historically. So the other narrative goes something like this good guy versus bad guy narrative that we've talked before, where these European imperialists are sort of these all-powerful evil bad guys, and the African people and the indigenous peoples from whatever area and the Native American people are these hapless and hopeless victims of this period in history. The problem that I have with this view is, one, it tends to focus on the Europeans mostly as more of a top-down approach rather than the bottom-up approach of what life was like for the indigenous peoples during this time period in history. And two, that this view in some ways takes away some level of agency to those indigenous peoples who played a huge role in ultimately having their own say in what happened, particularly on the continent of Africa, which is the focus of this episode. Ultimately, colonialism was complicated and messy, but it wasn't just the simplistic Europeans showed up and militarily conquered Africa and dominated them from that perspective. Colonialism and imperialism in Africa were a system of military, economic, and social systems that were put in place by European powers and authority structures to exploit the resources and peoples in Africa. So in addition to that military aspect of it, which is often the only focus, this includes everything from social constructs to travel legislation, to ideas about culture and the way society should be run, to the implementation of Western medicine that were either put into place by European authorities or reinforced by them. The African sleeping sickness epidemic that broke out in the Belgian Congo during the early 1900s is as good an example of this as any. The way that disease and epidemics unfold, how historians study them, and how that process has changed over time is one of the most interesting aspects of studying world history, at least in my opinion. When studied the right way, it can give you insights into how governments work, what social norms are at the time of epidemics, interplay between science and religion, the interplay between science and religion and public policy. All of these things can be captured by studying the history of epidemics. Epidemics and governments declaring epidemics is usually not simply a medical observation. Sometimes there are political or social agendas that are also at work. Here's historian Marion S. Lyons with an interesting take on this. Quote, "The study of epidemics and responses to them is an invaluable analytical tool with which to examine processes of change in societies. The proclamation of an epidemic by the prevailing authority is not simply a biological observation. It is often a social construct or a political act. In the new colonial territories in Africa at the turn of the century, European authorities very much needed control mechanisms, and epidemics, defined by the state, could provide the rationale for the introduction of a range of authoritarian measures. The extensive sleeping sickness legislation in the Belgian Congo was in fact an early example of attempts at social engineering in Africa, end quote. What Lyons is saying there is that typically we have this view that Western medicine is good and more indigenous or tribal styles of medicine is bad. And obviously, you're not going to get any argument from me that the best way to treat a disease is with the best medicine and the most scientific approach, obviously. But the problem is, especially during this time period, rolling out that best approach and implementing that practice often relies on the political structures that are already in place. So if you're trying to implement a medical practice into a society and you're not factoring in at all the basic political situation or the basic social and cultural and economic situations that are in that society, you are not going to have a lot of success implementing that medical approach. So what may end up being a better medical approach from a scientific perspective isn't going to be effective because you're not implementing it the best way you could. Anyway, the Belgian Congo was at the heart of Africa, geographically speaking. By the early 1900s, Belgium had been transitioning the Congo from more of an indirect imperialistic control to a more direct style of colony. As more and more people were entering the colony from Europe and from Belgium, it was discovered that there was an outbreak of what was known as sleeping sickness, and specifically the African sleeping sickness. And this was discovered to be epidemic in 1904. If you're wondering what sleeping sickness is, here's the World Health Organization. Quote, "Sleeping sickness is a widespread tropical disease that can be fatal if not treated. It is spread by the bite of an infected tsetse fly, a species native to the African continent. More than 60 million people who live mainly in rural parts of East, West, and Central Africa are at risk of contracting sleeping sickness. The fly bite erupts into a red sore, and within a few weeks, the person can experience fever, swollen lymph glands, aching muscles and joints, headaches, and irritability. In advanced stages, the disease attacks the central nervous system, and people present with changes in personality, alteration of the biological clock and circadian rhythm, confusion, slurred speech, seizures, and difficulty in walking and talking. These problems can develop over many years, and if not treated, the person dies." End quote. So if you were to get bitten by this fly that had a parasite, you would be infected with the parasite, and nowadays we have drugs that can kill the parasite relatively easily, but in 1904 in the Belgian Congo, that was not available. Different regions of the Belgian Congo were infected at different rates. So the Wele district in northeast Congo is the focus here. Now, this district in the northeast was mostly free of infection, and the Belgium and colonial authorities determined that it was important that it remain free of infection. This zone in the northeast of Congo was a border zone, so it shared a border with French Equatorial Africa, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and Uganda. The fact that it was a border zone in the northeast of Congo is important for a lot of reasons. One of which is that there's a ton of social and economic networks that are going through all of those different colonies and countries and areas. So trade is going to be significant. And if that gets interrupted by this epidemic, that could be a big problem for the colonial authorities. It's also important to focus on this zone for the colonial authorities because it is a border zone and people are moving across the borders, sometimes from unknown areas, and this was seen as a hazard for spreading the epidemic. Another thing that's important about this district in the northeast of Congo is that it provided a travel lane, if you look at a map, from the Congo River in West Africa to the Nile River in the northeast of Africa. Any zone that is going to connect two major rivers is going to be a major trade and communication route. At one point, a road was built known as the Route Royale, and huge amounts of trade would go along this road. There were also deposits of gold and other resources in this district, so as a result, keeping it healthy for exploitation or further economic and political development is going to be important for the colonial authorities. If you're looking at it from their perspective, the perspective of the people in charge of the Belgian Congo, you have various regions of your colony that are infected with this sleeping sickness, but you have this area in the northeast that we're focusing on that hasn't been infected too much, and you want to keep it that way for all the reasons that we discussed. So as a result of this, the people living in the Wele district of the Congo were going to face the full brunt of a colonial system that wanted to solve the problem and cure the epidemic. Obviously, this became a priority for the authorities, and the people that were living there, the average people, were now going to be subjected to all of the policies that the colonial authorities thought would solve the problem. This, of course, resulted in an increased level of intrusion into people's lives. So here's historian Marinez Lyons talking about what happens next. Quote, "Public health legislation was part of an increasing state intervention in many areas of social and economic life. For example, there were quarantine measures, sanitation regulations with legal sanctions, obligatory medical examinations, and medical passports and extensive sleeping sickness surveys. Activities such as fishing, agriculture, salt production, porterage, trade, canoe transport, and travel were all increasingly circumscribed by the legislation. Sometimes African populations were reorganized, resettled, and forbidden to return to their former territories to fish or cultivate. While the policy benefited some people in the northeastern Congo at the outset of the campaign, the fact remains that it caused significant distress for many Africans." End quote. Now, King Leopold II of Belgium, once he realized this epidemic was a problem, he's going to commission the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine to go down to the Congo, figure out what's going on, is this an epidemic or not, and also figure out how are we going to solve this problem. This is around 1903, by the way. So the king and the colonial authorities were worried because Europeans were now beginning to die in the Belgian Congo. So obviously he's worried about Europeans dying, but to some extent the colonial authorities are also worried about Africans dying from an economic point of view, because this will hinder their economic exploitation of the region. Here is one senior administrator in this region talking about why he's interested in protecting more Africans. Quote, "The populations of Wele seem, from a simple economic point of view, represent such capital that it seems to me to be no sacrifice to save them." End quote. He's saying there, look, it's in everyone's best interest to protect as many Europeans and Africans as possible because they're economically benefiting us. Once the School of Medicine gets in there, they get together with the colonial authorities. They're going to poke around a little bit, conduct some studies, check out what's going on in different regions of the Congo, and begin to implement the policies and solutions that they think are going to best solve the problem. Pretty much all of these solutions are based on a European understanding of epidemics at this time period in history, mainly from their experience with the plague as well as cholera. Based on this and the fact that at this point in history there was no cure for sleeping sickness, the main solution seemed to be what was known as cordon sanitaire. What this means is you basically seal off the infected people from the non-infected people to prevent the spread of the disease. You create a quarantine. Infected people go here, and uninfected people go over here, and that way we don't have the two mixing and the disease can't spread. This seems like a fairly common sense approach, and it was fairly well known as a policy prescription for these epidemics in Europe. Newer techniques that focused on public sanitation and hygiene were less well known and thus less well implemented in the Belgian Congo. These quarantine zones in the Belgian Congo were known as lazarets. So these were the places that the infected people were sent to and quarantined from everybody else. But the question now becomes, how do you implement a quarantine in this region of Africa? It's one thing to quarantine people in Europe, but it's a totally different situation in the Belgian Congo. You still have military conquest going on, and you still have a indigenous people that isn't necessarily happy with colonial control. Many indigenous populations are obviously hostile to European occupation, and that in many ways was no different in the Belgian Congo. So how do you convince African populations that a quarantine is in their best interest, especially when you don't know much about how these societies work or how they think about medicine, so on and so forth? And the reality is many Europeans didn't care how these societies worked, or they didn't care about how Africans thought about medicine. They just wanted to implement what they saw as the better solution. And again, even if that Western medicine solution is better, which I think is fair to argue, if you don't understand how the cultures think about medicine or how indigenous peoples think about these types of things, it's going to be really hard to implement a strategy that works. It seems that many indigenous African populations thought that epidemics came from quote-unquote famine and hard times. So they would often curse these two things and find ways to work around hard times to hopefully prevent disease. Now, they seem to understand that there were many socioeconomic factors that go into disease, but they didn't seem to have a full grasp of germ theory and Western medicine and this type of thing. And of course, disease and medicine varied from place to place in Africa and from indigenous population to indigenous population, so it's not fair to paint with a broad brush. But it seems like if you had a European perspective of Western medicine and you merged that with a more indigenous African understanding of some of these socioeconomic factors that go into disease, then you would have a much better approach during this period for medicine as a whole. Unfortunately, the European colonial authorities really didn't pay too much attention to some of those underlying factors that go into disease. Here's Mary Inez Lyons saying, quote, "I have no evidence that the Liverpool researchers advised the Congo State Administration to give attention to the living and working conditions of the Africans as a means to prevent epidemics of sleeping sickness." End quote. At any rate, the game plan for the colonial authorities was established. The game plan was a number of different things. But first of all, it was the establishment of those lazarets, establishing a quarantine, and protecting the uninfected regions of the Congo, like this northeast Wele district that we're talking about. The idea was to quote-unquote weed out any Africans with the disease by examining quote-unquote swollen lymph glands and finding people who had them, isolating them, and really any European could do this and recommend a African person to be weeded out. Here's Lyons summarizing that, quote, "They suggested that all Africans with swollen lymph glands should be isolated and examined. In this way, all existing victims of sleeping sickness in unaffected regions, like Wele, could be weeded out through the alert eyes of each European residing in the area. Anyone, they reported, even a trained African clerk, could detect swollen glands." End quote. It seems at first, rather than relying on medical professionals, they were just relying on the population to self-diagnose. And this method was later on found to have about a 50 or 60% error rate as far as diagnosis goes. Once it was thought that you were infected, colonial authorities would search and isolate these people into lazarets. This meant being removed from your home and placed into a quarantine zone. There was no family visits allowed, and you were forced to go there and stay there. Unless, on the other hand, you were still able to work. If you could contribute to the economy in some way, then it was seen as being okay to continue living in the population. But of course, how do they resolve this where we don't want to have that Northeast region get infected with this sleeping sickness? So they decided, you know what? We're just going to transfer that person to an infected district in the Congo and go from there. So you had all kinds of people that were forced to go into these other areas of the Congo and work. This includes, of course, people who were infected, but it also includes people that weren't infected. Because remember, this method of just self-diagnosing essentially and having people determine if your glands were swollen or not, that was a 50 or 60% error rate. So what's kind of sad to think about is you have to factor in probably a whole bunch of people got sent into infected zones of the Congo and probably contracted the disease when they otherwise wouldn't have. You just wonder how many people ended up getting infected by this process that was theoretically designed to lower the number of infections. So we have establishing lazarets and quarantines, weeding out Africans who have the disease, searching and isolating these people, sending them into different work zones, and eventually many Africans were totally prevented from traveling. The idea being they can't spread the disease if they can't travel. Another method of solving the epidemic was to provide a toxil, which is a medicine that was injected into the African people, and believe it or not, it caused a 30% blindness rate. I'm not sure about you, but I am not sure how much I would want to receive an injection of medicine that had a 30% chance of blinding me. But anyway, this game plan from the European authorities is starting to have some holes poked in it if you start looking at it logically. African peoples were confused, even European people were confused, and there was all sorts of ineptitude going on. Which lazaret do these people get sent to? How do they get there if they're not allowed to travel? What facilities are we going to use? How do we keep these people in the lazarets? How do we guard them? We don't have enough resources or manpower. Because when you think about it, this is a colony-wide quarantine. That is a huge logistical operation. It turns out religious missions helped at first, but they began shying away once they saw that this whole solution didn't seem to be helping any, and the human cost was high. This didn't stop the colonial authorities and the government from continuing to try and implement a solution. That solution and the implementation of it that we just talked about was devastating to many Africans in the region. First of all, the lazarets were perceived as death camps by many Africans. There was an understandable avoidance and flight from being treated at these places, which the mortality rates were high at. Here's one director of one of these lazarets saying, quote, "Strictly speaking, it was a permanent prison and should bear the inscription, 'Abandon all hope, ye who enter here,'" end quote. One doctor who was making a report to the League of Nations in 1923 said that the policy in the Congo with these lazarets was bad because, quote, "compulsory isolation imposed as a military measure proved disastrous. The natives ran away, avoided the visits, lay hid. The fear of the medical officer and his needle was such that entire villages fled," end quote. And when you look at conditions in many of these lazarets, it's hard to blame people for trying to get out of them or running away. examinations of Africans were constantly taking place, and again, those examinations could take place by anyone at any time. Oftentimes, these examinations were treated like military maneuvers where doctors and others would sweep around a village and slowly work their way to the center. One doctor said, quote, "Brush ahead of him like the hunter," end quote. This kind of shows how this was seen as almost like a hunting exercise. And then once the examination took place, another doctor said, quote, "One should decide for each case if infected individuals should be sent outside the territory or if they should be interned in the lazarets," end quote. Once you were inside the lazaret, you received that atoxyl injection that had a chance to make you blind 30% of the time. You were not allowed to receive any visits from family, and oftentimes you had to work inside the lazaret, usually without pay. You had to work on building things or cleaning up or doing things like this. All of a sudden, this is starting to sound a little bit like slavery here. One director of a lazaret who seemed to feel bad that he was working these people without pay asks the colonial authorities to get money so that he could pay these people. He said, quote, "We cannot without injustice not give them 15 centimes a day," end quote. The vice governor general of that area didn't seem to listen, and these people in the lazarets had to do everything from work and construction to farming their own food, again, without pay. Here's one lazaret director talking about the conditions in June of 1910. Quote, "We have had no meat or fish, as what should go to the patients has been taken for the laborers and soldiers. I cannot obtain rice or salt. People who are here only under observation often stay months and receive no salt or oil and are forced to roam about haggling," end quote. Obviously, conditions in these lazarets are not ideal. Another question is, what do you do with families and kin who want to stay with the sick victims? This is an African custom that the Belgian government was ignorant of, but obviously many families wanted to be with the sick victims. One administrator asked, quote, "I want to know if the families of the patients can live at the post, and if they can be rationed by the state, as often if one member is hospitalized, the others in the family do not want to leave. It would be cruel to send them away, but if the state cannot feed them," end quote. It seems that now these lazarets had a problem of families coming in, which they weren't prepared to ration for or feed, and so on and so forth. And directors start doing things like trying to determine if the families are legitimate or if they have the official licenses for the marriages and things like this. So all of a sudden, lazarets are wasting time and resources trying to determine if these African marriages are legal from the colonial authority perspective, instead of spending time trying to help the victims and accommodating the families. The underlying problem for many lazarets was that they simply didn't have enough manpower to help. You need medical teams, you need surveillance, you need security, you need nurses to make this whole thing work, and that's obviously going to strain the system. Riots of the population of these lazarets occurred in 1909 and 1910, which highlighted the system obviously failing in a lot of ways. I found it interesting, but perhaps not surprising, that when the colonial authorities heard about these riots in what were these essentially prison camps, these lazarets, they were not surprised. One lazaret director said, quote, "We always had the vague impression that something bad could happen," end quote. This, of course, begs the question, if you know something bad is going to happen here, then why do it? Is the Western medicine influencing the way that colonial authorities deal with disease, or is colonial authorities dictating the way that Western medicine is being implemented. It seems like you could make a stronger argument for the latter in this case. It eventually became clear to even the colonial authorities that reforms needed to be made. The system as it was in place with these lazarets wasn't working. The Africans didn't want any part of them. They had limited resources and manpower to help, and they started figuring out that they needed staff to go to the African people if they wanted to help them, rather than relying on Africans to be searched and isolated and more or less rounded up, because that takes time. And obviously Africans aren't going to volunteer to go to these lazarets on their own. So one thing they did was they changed the lazarets to sort of lazaret villages rather than simply isolated prisons. Here, victims could live with their families and they were still isolated in a way, but they could have the comforts of home. There were still some isolation centers for more extreme cases, but by and large, you were allowed to live in these lazaret villages towards the end of this epidemic period. Another reform that was made was known as Sanitary Brigades. So these groups of people would go around sanitizing villages and lazarets, making them look more amenable and just cleaner and better kept. And all of a sudden, more Africans wanted in when they knew they were sick with the sleeping sickness. Instead of looking like a prison camp, it looked like a village or a medical facility. Laws were put into place that made all Europeans and Africans more responsible. Anyone who didn't do their duty as far as reporting sleeping sickness cases or getting treatment could be prosecuted. Medical passports were passed out to Africans so they could now travel, and it was up to the colonial authorities to make sure that the sickness didn't spread. Another reform was European authorities reached out to African chiefs and leaders to get them more involved. A system based on cooperation and understanding would be better than a system of direct control and telling people what to do, is what the Europeans started to figure out. Another change that helped with the epidemic was simply that the colony as a whole was going through some administrative changes around 1912 and towards the end of the decade, the first decade of the 20th century there. This meant that more resources could be devoted to the epidemic, and a better understanding of what was going on could be understood and implemented. So ultimately, while not perfect, better solutions to the lazaret situation and better reforms to the colonial policies regarding sleeping sickness were put in place, and ultimately this ended up helping more people. But not before a ton of damage had already been done to the indigenous people of Africa in this region. The lazaret system and colonial authority and the medical practice that the Belgian authority was putting into practice for the better part of a decade had a huge impact on the ordinary lives of people. As we mentioned before, this northeast region of the Congo was heavily based in trade, which was an important aspect of many people's lives. These policies that the colonial authorities put into place heavily impacted trade. When you consider how bad the lazarets were and how bad the conditions were there, it's not surprising that people would see reforms and policies like that come down from the colonial authorities, and then when other regulations were made, regardless of whether they were helpful or not, the ordinary African people often believed that these regulations were out to get them. And there was a negative connotation to many of these regulations. Just as another example, canoe use and trading through canoes was something that had long been a part of the culture and history of this region. The colonial authorities came in and banned canoes, often destroying or confiscating them. This led to people struggling in their daily lives, struggling to trade in rubber, salt, or other trade goods. As far as the gold mines and some of these salt mines and other places, labor organizations were impacted, oftentimes being banned as a way of the colonial authorities saying, we don't want disease to spread, so we can't have these labor organizations meet, which many Africans didn't take kindly to. Those sanitation brigades, while they did clean things up a little bit, and while they did make the lazarets look better, they also cleared a lot of usable salt grass from a lot of different areas in this northeast Congo. When many ordinary Africans asked, hey, can we get reimbursed for some of that salt grass that you cleared off of our territory? Of course, the colonial authorities said, no chance. Ordinary Africans had to do all sorts of things to get around some of the travel restrictions, including separating themselves from families, trying to find loopholes in the regulations in order to get around. But the long and short of all the restrictions and legislation is that it impacted the lives of Africans in a variety of negative ways. As we talked about at the beginning of the episode, this was not simply the militaristic European imperialism that many people think of, and while that was certainly a big part of it, this was a more indirect form of control where colonial authorities used Western medicine and the outbreak of a sleeping sickness epidemic to further cement their positions of authority and power, even if they didn't necessarily have the goal of doing that. And furthermore, they contributed to a lasting negative legacy of imperialism and the perception of Europeans on the part of the indigenous African people. Sadly, this is a legacy that would continue into the later years of the 20th century with different outbreaks of epidemics and things like the AIDS outbreak or the more recent Ebola epidemic, where many Africans had a distrust of European authority and Western medicine, and probably with fair reason. For example, these quarantines that we talked about today, where people were forced to live without their families and sent to die in these death camps and injected with drugs that didn't work. Obviously, people are going to remember that type of thing, and it significantly impacted in later years people's ability to help stop some of these really deadly and devastating epidemics in Africa. So while obviously the answer to disease and sickness is more science, better medicine, effective drugs, and all of that stuff, I think that people have learned a lesson over the course of the 20th century, and that lesson is that disease and sickness and health is not just about the medical and the science aspect of it, but it's also about the well-being of the individual and how you actually go about implementing a medical plan politically and socially into a society.